Hello everyone, it's Heather, and today's video is an unexpected trip announcement. On the day I'm posting this video, we are flying to Orlando, Florida. I know we just went to Orlando, Florida when we went on our Harmony of the Seas cruise, which you haven't seen those videos yet. Those videos are coming later this week. So the whole series of our videos from our Harmony of the Seas cruise, which we took at the end of May, beginning of June, are coming right after this one. So stay tuned for those. Be sure that you're subscribed if you don't want to miss any of our upcoming cruise and other travel content. Now, originally, when I talked about our plans for travel this summer, I had in mind, I hadn't booked everything yet or anything at that point, but I had in mind that we were going to take 3 trips. One, that cruise that we took at the end of May and beginning of June for Megan's 18th birthday. I wanted to go to Europe in July, and then I wanted to take a cruise in late August for my 50th birthday. That's all still sort of happening, but it's a little different than what I intended for a couple of reasons. We are still taking 3 trips, one in June, one in July, and one in August, like I intended, basically. However, we could not go to Europe in July. And the reason we could not go to Europe in July is because the airfare to Europe, I searched and searched and searched. I was checking every possible airline you could check, was just way too expensive. Everything I was looking at for leaving to go to Europe in July, we were looking at a minimum of $1,800 to $2,000 or higher per ticket round trip for airfare. And that was just insane. And I couldn't afford that. And so what we ended up doing was we had nothing planned in July, which I wasn't very happy about because there was going to be this big 2-month gap between trips. We ended up combining the trip to Europe because I found a very good round trip deal on Delta between Boston and London Heathrow for about $800 some each. But what's going to end up happening is we're going to go to Europe for about 3 weeks, and then we're going to come back via Boston again. We're going to go see Anastasia in Boston, the touring Broadway show that I didn't get to see during the pandemic that I've talked about in past videos. Because of the pandemic, the date kept getting changed, and then we didn't feel comfortable going because it was during the Omicron surge or Delta surge or something. We're going to see Anastasia with Andrew in Boston, and then we're going to fly to Miami, and we're going to go on a cruise for my 50th birthday on the Disney Dream. Fingers crossed, testing dependent. Basically, we're going on a month-long trip at the end of the summer. And we had a big gap here in the middle of the summer between coming back from our Harmony of the Seas cruise, which was on June 5th, and August when we go on our other big trip. So I wasn't real happy about that because that's not what I intended. And also, that's a long time to be gone and things like that. So we are still doing those things, all the things I planned on doing. The cruise for Megan's 18th birthday, Europe, and the cruise for my 50th birthday. They're just not scheduled in the way I had originally intended or hoped. Something came up, though, that is the reason that we're flying to Orlando today. My dad, who is alive and well and lives in the same town as us, and always has, he still lives in the house that I grew up in, is 80 years old. His parents had 4 kids. They had 2 girls, and then they had my dad, and then they had my dad's brother. So they had 2 girls and then 2 boys. My dad is the third of 4. His immediate older sister, she passed away recently. I feel very badly about that because she was one of my favorite aunts. And neither my dad nor I had seen her. I hadn't seen her in probably 9 or 10 years. The last time I saw her or talked to her was at her and my uncle's 50th anniversary party at my cousin's house in Minnesota. And my kids were very little. Megan and Ben were very little. She had Parkinson's disease. She wasn't in the best of health because of that. And then she developed Parkinson's dementia near the end of her life. She, kind of similar to me, she and my uncle lived in a very nice place in the Twin Cities that had a lot of stairs. And I don't think that was probably the easiest or the safest place for her to be living with her health the way it was. There were a couple factors that went into play with both me and my dad not seeing her for the last several years of her life. My dad had seen her more recently than I had. He didn't see her for the entire first 2 years of the pandemic because my uncle was concerned about protecting her health during the pandemic, which I totally understand, and didn't really want any visitors. And then they moved to Arizona. They and my cousin, their oldest son, and his wife and son, who had for many, many years lived in Southern California in the Los Angeles area. I don't know who decided to move first or if it was a joint decision or what the deal was, but they moved from California to Arizona, and then my aunt and uncle moved from Minnesota to Arizona, and they live in the same town now. And shortly after they moved there, my cousin and his wife, they bought a house. My uncle and my aunt, they were living in a retirement community, which also had an assisted living facility like attached to it or part of it. And shortly after they moved there, my aunt had to move into the assisted living facility. And then shortly after that, she passed away. So because of the pandemic and because they had relocated to Arizona, my dad had not seen his sister for quite a few years, like 5 years, I think, maybe. And I hadn't seen her for, like I said, like 9 or 10 years. So we feel kind of sad about that because we hadn't gotten to see her or talk to her or anything in the last several years of her life. And I especially feel bad for my dad because that was his sister. It kind of bothered me that he hadn't made an effort to go see her before she died because we knew she was gonna die fairly soon. His brother did go. He and his wife drove out there, which I wouldn't do that, but they drove to Arizona and spent some time with her after she had moved to Arizona. My dad's real challenge is a couple things. One is, to some extent, it's finances. His finances aren't the same as they were when he was younger. And also, he still works. And it's hard for him to get any kind of extended time off of work. That brings me to the reason we're going to Florida. My dad's other sister, the oldest sister, her husband is currently ill with lymphoma, and he does not have much time left. I'm genuinely hoping he's still with us today by the time we get down there, because he might not be. And so we are going down there to see him and see my aunt and my cousins that are there. They're adult kids that are my cousins. I kind of pushed my dad. I really felt it was important, especially because he hadn't seen his other sister before she passed away. I really felt it was important that he go and see them. They stayed with, kind of lived with my dad periodically. They actually spent basically their entire adult lives living in Brazil. My uncle is actually British, and it's a long story, but my uncle is actually British, and my aunt and uncle actually spent their entire lives living in Brazil. Their children were all born in Brazil, and they just recently, in the past few years, resettled in Sanford, Florida. Again, they're in their 80s. My aunt is not in the best of health either, and my daughter Megan and I were discussing when we were talking about this. We're a little concerned. They've been married for 67 years, and we're a little concerned that when my uncle passes away here shortly, that my aunt might follow soon after. It just might be one of those situations. That's what happened with their parents, my grandparents, my dad's parents. My grandfather died in March of 1994 on St. Patrick's Day, and my grandmother died exactly 1 year later in March of 1995. And they were married a long time too. So it's one of those where I just kind of worry about the health of the surviving spouse when they've been married such a long, long time. When they lived in Brazil for so many years, because they had to, it's a thing with your citizenship status, and because my uncle was British, I think he had a green card. I'm not sure what the deal was with that, but they had to come back to the United States periodically for citizenship reasons. And whenever they did, they stayed with my dad. So they were pretty close with my dad. My dad is the one who kind of set me on the path of loving travel. And I've talked about this in past videos. And if you haven't watched my Misadventures in Travel playlist, a lot of those misadventures in travel stories involve traveling with my dad. Just for various reasons, you know, his age and his financial situation and things like that. My dad's he's sort of done all the traveling. He is happy. I don't know if he's necessarily happy to do it. I mean, he's kind of settled into life now where he's very happy to. He goes for bike rides and he golfs and he plays tennis, and he's a very active guy, but he just doesn't travel the way he used to. And I traveled a lot with my dad when I was younger, from 10 until I moved out on my own. I even traveled with him as an adult with my son Andrew before I got married. We traveled with him as a family as late as 2007 with my husband and my kids. The last major trip that we flew, in 2005, we went on Amtrak to Washington, D.C. with my dad. And Megan was a baby. She was 1. And Andrew and my husband. And then in 2006, we flew to Boston with my dad. And that at that time, still my husband, me, Megan was 2, and Andrew. Also in 2007, my dad and I flew Andrew to Dallas to go to Andrew's dad's graduation from basic training at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Andrew's dad's wife and their other kids, she drove, but Andrew doesn't like riding in the car that far, and he got car sick a lot and stuff. He didn't want to do that, so we said, we'll fly him down there and meet you, and then he can go to his dad's graduation and everything, and we'll go do other stuff. So that's what we did. And then also in 2007, we went to Las Vegas. Yeah, except that time, that was interesting. I was pregnant with Ben. So pregnant me and little Megan flew to Las Vegas. My dad, my husband, and Andrew took Amtrak to Las Vegas, and we met each other there. So that was kind of an interesting trip too. But we used to do things like that all the time. But that was about the end of it. About 2007, 2008, about the time of the recession, our traveling kind of came to a halt. Not just my dad, but us too. It was quite a while then, 2012 really, before we flew anywhere or anything, I think. So there was a gap there, and then we really never traveled with my dad after that. And so when I was thinking about my dad going down to see his sister and his brother-in-law at this important time, I was concerned for him. If you have an elderly parent or relative, you might know what I'm talking about. Technology has swooped past my dad, and he can do some things fine. He has a smartphone. He doesn't use it to its full capability, and he had to use a computer in his, he uses computers in his work and stuff. It's challenging for him. This is one of those where I've had the long conversations on the phone with my father trying to explain how to do things on the computer, and different times my kids have gone over to his house and tried to show him how to do certain things, and it's just a challenging area for him. And I was thinking about it, that the Minneapolis airport, so my dad hasn't flown in at least 15 years, I think, yeah. And most of the time that he flew on an airplane, he was always with me. There's only like 2 or 3 times that my dad flew on an airplane without me. The very first time he flew with my mom, which was before I was born. And then he reminded me there were a couple times he had to fly to Las Vegas for insurance meetings. My dad was an insurance agent for over 50 years. Those were over 20 years ago. They were probably 25, 30 years ago, honestly, I think. The technology thing concerned me. The airport experience is very tech heavy. The travel experience as a whole is going to be easier, faster, and more efficient the more you can use technology. Me, for example, I use my smartphone as much as possible. I've talked about this. Might never talk to an employee at a hotel. I will check in with the app. I will use a digital key. I might never have any contact with anybody who works there. It really is to your advantage in today's travel climate to rely on technology as much as you can. For example, when we had to change our flights last August when the hurricane was coming to Boston and everything was shut down and we decided we're just going to go home, it was very simple and easy for me to change my flight on the app, on the Delta app on my phone. Rather than the Delta hold times at that time were 5-6 hours to get somebody on the phone. My dad would be one of those people that would be trying to get somebody on the phone. And that's not going to work. And that's especially not going to work over the 4th of July weekend in the current travel climate. He's not altogether comfortable driving to or in the Twin Cities. I'm not altogether comfortable with him driving to or in the Twin Cities or to the airport. And the parking situation there is weird, and they've changed it. I'm pretty sure they've completely renovated the Minneapolis airport at least twice since the last time my dad flew. They've made some very significant changes just in the past year or two. Since we first started flying, since the beginning of the pandemic to now, it's very different than it was. So I feel like he would have a difficult time navigating his way through the airport. And then TSA is weird. He has flown post 9/11, so he knows some of those things, but it's been a long time. And TSA stuff is changing all the time. I mean, I swear every time I go to the airport and at different airports, the TSA experience is completely different. And TSA can be tough. I mean, they're not necessarily the most cheerful people on the planet, and they can be kind of stern with you. And I kept thinking about all these things, and I'm like, boy, Dad, I really feel like I'd feel so much better if I could take you to the airport, or if I could get you through the airport, and I'd really like to get you through security. And we started thinking about, one possibility that Megan thought of was maybe he could go later this summer when we are flying to Europe. I could get him a flight to Florida at about the same time of day. We wouldn't necessarily have to be taking the planes to the same places. Once you're past security, the experience of the airport and being on the plane isn't really any different. And especially now that the pandemic stuff isn't really in place anymore, there's no more masks required and things like that. We think he'd be okay. But then my uncle's illness progressed very rapidly and he's not doing very well. And so my dad really wanted to go now. So that's what's happening. We are going with my dad. I mean, first of all, to also see family and, all of that. But then my dad can only stay for 2 days. So I booked his ticket for him and we're going down today and he's coming back on Tuesday. But we're going to stay till Friday, and we're going to take advantage of the fact that we're making this trip. We're going to stay in Orlando and do some other things. So I will be making videos about those. So make sure that you, and I know, July in Florida. Yeah, but stay tuned for those because those will be coming then immediately after the Harmony of the Seas cruise vlogs finish. It'll be a while because there's a lot of videos from our Harmony of the Seas cruise. So again, lots and lots of content coming. I do want to touch on a couple of things really quick that particularly concerned me that you might want to think about if you have an elderly parent or relative or someone in your family or your friends or whatever, even if they're not older, that if they don't travel a lot, and they are an inexperienced traveler, or at least they haven't traveled in the past number of years. There are some particular things, and some of them I've already mentioned, that I think are really important to think about that you might want to make sure, if you know someone who's going to be traveling, and they haven't traveled for quite a while, that you might want to talk about them with. There's 3 big things. One is 9/11 and terrorism. And now, like I said, my dad had flown since 9/11. So he knew the thing like having to take off your shoes. Now that's not related directly to 9/11, but it's related to a terrorism incident that happened shortly afterwards. But taking off your shoes is still something that's happening. And the limit on liquids in your carry-on. Now, they are implementing new technology at airports. Orlando has it, actually. We went through that when we came back from our cruise. There's some new scanners that you don't have to take the liquids out of your bag and you don't have to take the electronics out of your bag. But those are being implemented in stages at airports all over the country and it might take a while. Some of the European airports are no longer requiring you with liquids and things. But it depends on the airport. And so that's something, you got to be aware of. Like you can't have, it's the 311. It's actually 3.4 ounces. Any liquids, and toothpaste counts as a liquid, by the way. So you have to have 3.4 ounces, anything that's a liquid, in a 1-quart Ziploc bag. And you can have 1 bag per person. So that's the 311. So if you haven't traveled since 9/11 or it's been a while and you forgot about that, those are 2 things that you're going to want to be aware of. And then going along with 9/11, this one has been very slow coming. But I'm pretty sure that this has to do with being an anti-terrorism measure, but it might have something to do with other stuff too. I'm not sure. The Real ID. My dad had never heard of this. My dad had never heard of Real ID. He didn't know what it was. And he is pretty sure, because he doesn't remember ever taking his birth certificate or his passport to the DMV. Now, Megan never learned to drive. She doesn't really, sometimes she feels like she'd like to learn how to drive. The pandemic timing and everything all messed her up for driver's ed. But now she's over 18, she doesn't have to take driver's ed. So we debate every once in a while. We don't really have time for me to teach her how to drive, but she wouldn't have to take driver's ed at this point. She can just take the test and then take the road test. And we might do that before she goes to college. We haven't really decided. But anyway, we did have to go get her a state ID because Megan didn't have any kind of ID other than her passport. And you don't want to be hauling your passport around with you everywhere. Right after we got back from our cruise, we went to get her a state ID, and we wanted her to have a real ID because we travel a lot and we fly a lot domestically. And if you don't know this, if you don't have a real ID, which is a special form of state ID or driver's license where they have taken extra steps to verify your identity and your citizenship, just like a passport. If you don't have that, after May 3rd, 2023, you will not be able to fly domestically in the United States. So if you haven't gotten your real ID, make sure you get that. And the reason it was supposed to start several years ago, and many states had already, Wisconsin was one of them. Wisconsin, it went into effect like October 1st, 2020. So I think if you fly out of Wisconsin, which we never do, but if you fly out of Wisconsin, I think you already have to have the real ID. Somebody tell me if you know, if your state has already implemented it, let me know about that in the comments below. But at the federal level, the real ID is going to go into effect on May 3rd, 2023. And it's been pushed back a couple times because some states, including Minnesota, were holding it up because they hadn't implemented it in their state. And that's why that, and I think the pandemic is why it got pushed back a couple times. But it is going into effect. And my dad had never heard of this. And he didn't know anything about it. And if it had already been in effect, leaving out of Minneapolis, and he tried to go with just his regular driver's license that's not a real ID, he would not have gotten through security, and he would have not been able to fly to Florida. And he wouldn't have understood why. So that's something to make sure people are aware of. Okay, so 9/11 related stuff. Second thing is pandemic related stuff. We've flown several times during the pandemic, and we have flown since the pandemic measures have started to relax. For the most part, I would say, having flown as recently as a few weeks ago, at least in US airports, you really can't tell anymore that there's a pandemic going on. But I would say that the airport is one of the places that I do still see a significant number of people, including us, wearing masks, just because they're trying to be safe, and on planes. A lot of people don't. But I see more people wearing masks at the airport and on planes than I do any place else where I live. The one other place I tend to see people wearing masks a lot is Target. So go figure. That's just, the type of clientele that Target markets to are the type of people who feel that wearing masks are important, I guess, just like us. If it was a year ago or even 6 months ago, that mask mandate was still in place, and everybody had to have a mask on for the whole airport experience, for your whole flight, all of that. So that would have been something to be aware of. Now, keep in mind, there's always the possibility they could put that back into effect, or other measures or things like that, because of, rising cases or a new variant that's way worse or something like that, Also related to the pandemic, although it doesn't seem like it, is the mess that is air travel as of right now. It's the 4th of July weekend, 2022, and you've probably seen in the news, just yesterday, Delta, the day before I'm filming this, Delta made an announcement that they were not going to charge people the difference in fare if they had to reschedule or change a flight because of flight disruptions. Lufthansa is an absolute mess. Amsterdam Schiphol Airport is an absolute mess. There's a lot of trouble with flying right now. And the reason for that is pandemic related. It's all related. And I don't think people think about the connections. Some of it is because people get sick. Some of it is because cabin crew and pilots and ground crew and all of the airport staff and all of that get COVID and can't work. And that has a ripple effect on the whole process. The other thing is there is a severe pilot shortage. Air travel is so interconnected, even weather. You have a storm over here, it affects flights in 50 different cities because everything, the timing of everything is all connected. It's so complicated. Air traffic controllers, TSA agents, all of those people are vulnerable to the virus. They've also all been impacted by staffing shortages. These are all frontline workers. They're all dealing with and interacting with the public, everybody that works in the airport, everybody that works on the plane, all of that. And so there's a lot of staffing shortages, and there's a whole bunch of issues along with that. And that has collided with suddenly massive increase in demand for travel. There's a huge interest in traveling right now because there's such a pent-up demand for people who haven't traveled like they want to through the whole pandemic. You might have heard about revenge travel, people going on these big major bucket list trips that they have been wanting to do for years or whatever. I mean, for us even, we're going to France and Switzerland this summer because Megan's trip to France and Switzerland got canceled 2 years ago at the beginning of the pandemic. I wanted to make sure she got to do that. But all of that is adding a layer of complexity and challenge to air travel. And if you don't know what you're doing and you don't know what to do when things don't go right, if you're delayed, if you don't know how early you need to get to the airport, because if you might, it might take 2 hours to get through that security line. What to do if your flight gets delayed, if you don't know what to do if your flight gets canceled, all of these things. So it's tricky, and you need to be very, very patient, and you need to plan ahead, and you need to be prepared. And so for these older or infrequent travelers, they may not realize that. Okay, and then the third thing is technology. Like I was talking about before, this is especially a challenging area for my dad. There's not really anybody in the airport to help you anymore. There's not really, that might go along with the staffing thing. Everything's electronic. It's either on your phone or maybe it's on a kiosk. If you want to actually talk to a person, get ready to wait in a very, very long line. You might wait in a line for 45 minutes or an hour or 90 minutes just to get up to one of those two people that are working at the counter. And then you got a 50-50 chance. They're either going to be super friendly and helpful, or they're going to be very stern and businesslike and not really want to answer your questions. I've encountered both. So if you don't know what you're doing and you don't know, I've had many people come up to me in the last year or two when we've been traveling, because they see that I obviously know what I'm doing. And I've had quite a few people come up to me and say, "Excuse me, can you help me? How do I use this? Or where do I take my suitcase to drop it off? Or what do I do here?" You know, and I've always been able to help people, and I've always been able to answer their questions, and they're always very grateful because they can't find anybody to answer their questions. There's no employee or staff member or whatever. At a lot of airports now, there'll be a big bank of kiosks, and you're expected to go in and do it all yourself. And there might be one airline employee there to help everybody. And they just, you know, you might have to wait a while or try to get their attention or something. And like the whole thing with everything being on your phone, if people aren't used to using apps for everything, and they aren't used to using their smartphone for everything, or they don't have a smartphone, that whole aspect of it. You can still get by without a smartphone, but boy, it really helps. I just wanted to explain to you what we're doing, that we're going on a trip here to Florida and what's happening with that the main reason is because I really felt strongly that I wanted to accompany my dad, and Megan and Ben too, that we wanted to go with Grandpa and help him get there safely and, you know, successfully, so that he doesn't have to worry about all this airport stuff and travel stuff, that I can get him through that process. And we also wanted to go see our family, and so that's what we're doing. But then, because, you know, it was expensive, the tickets, because my dad is coming back just in 2 days, his ticket was very expensive. It was $698. Our tickets were less expensive, $408 I think I paid per ticket. But again, that's another thing that's happening right now is inflation. The prices of everything are just higher than normal. Normally, I wouldn't want to spend $400, would be $350 would be about my limit for domestic travel. We got a little bit less expensive tickets than my dad because we're going to stay a little longer and do some other things while we're down there. Give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed or appreciated this video. Be sure to leave your questions and comments down below. Oh, and don't worry, we will be back before my next live stream next Saturday, and that will be a live stream focused on Disney. And so if you have Disney questions or things you're wondering about Disney, or what's the status of things with the Disney parks, we just went to Disneyland in January, be sure to join me for the live stream at 2 o'clock Central Time on Saturday. So that's July 9th. And hopefully you were able to join me yesterday for our live stream talking about my Harmony of the Seas cruise. If you didn't get a chance to watch that yet, please go back and watch it. And if I didn't answer your question about cruising in the live stream, leave me a comment on that video and I'll answer those. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video, everyone. I hope you're all safe and well. Have a great day and safe travels.